The first thing Renee ever said to me was that she did not belong there. Not in those words exactly, but that was the meaning underneath everything she said in those early weeks, the current running below every conversation. She said the case had been mishandled, that her lawyer had been incompetent, that the witnesses had lied, that the system had failed her in every direction. She said it with a conviction that was hard to argue with, because she believed it completely. And when someone believes something completely, that belief has a texture that feels like truth. I believed her for almost 2 years. I want to be honest about that before I tell you anything else, because the honest version of this story is the only version worth telling. I believed her. I built my life around that belief, and I was wrong. Not wrong in a small way that could be quietly corrected. Wrong in a way that cost me money and friendships, and a year of my life that I will never get back, and a version of myself that I am still trying to understand. Her name was Renee Caldwell. She was 37 years old when we met, serving 8 years for aggravated assault and theft, and she had been inside for 3 years already. I was 32. I worked as a paralegal at a small family law firm, which is important because it meant I was not naive about the legal system, or at least I thought I was not. I knew how cases got built, and how they sometimes fell apart. I knew that innocent people went to prison, and that guilty people sometimes walked free. I knew the system was imperfect in ways that were not random but followed very specific patterns. I used all of that knowledge to convince myself that Renee was exactly who she said she was, which was a person who had been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect her. We met through a letter program that a community organization ran, matching volunteers with incarcerated people for correspondence. I had signed up because a colleague at work had mentioned it, and it sounded like a meaningful thing to do with some of my spare time. I was not looking for a relationship. I want to be clear about that because the story is easier to dismiss if I was lonely and desperate. And I was not. I was relatively content. I had friends. I had a life that felt reasonably full. I was just someone who thought that writing letters to a person in a hard situation was a decent thing to do. Her first letter was extraordinary. I do not use that word lightly. It was articulate and sharp and funny in the dry way that very intelligent people are funny, like they are observing the world from a slight distance and finding it absurd but not unkind. She described the facility with a precision that felt literary. She described the other women with empathy and humor. She described herself with a clarity that I mistook for self-awareness. She talked about her case into paragraphs at the end, matter of fact, no drama, just the outline of what had happened and what she believed had gone wrong. She said she was not asking me to believe her. She said she was just telling me so I had the full picture. I wrote back the same week. She wrote back for days later. Within a month we were writing twice a week, and within 2 months I had agreed to take her calls. The calls were where I started to get pulled in deeper than I understood at the time. Renee was magnetic on the phone in a way that was different from the letters. The letters were considered and careful. The calls were alive, immediate, responsive. She remembered everything I had told her, every small detail, and she referenced those details in ways that made me feel genuinely seen. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers in a way that felt complete, like she was not waiting for her turn to talk but actually receiving what I said. People who make you feel listened to have a power that is easy to underestimate, especially when you are not watching for it. She told me about her case in increasing detail over those first months. The story was complicated but coherent. She had been working as a manager at a retail operation owned by a man she described as controlling and dishonest. There had been a confrontation with a coworker, physical in some way, disputed in its origin and severity. There had been money missing from the business, which she said her employer had set her up to take the fall for. She said the coworker had lied about what happened between them, that her employer had coached the testimony, that her public defender had met with her for a total of 40 minutes before trial. Every piece of the story fit with the next piece, and every piece was consistent across different conversations, and I used that consistency as evidence that she was telling the truth. What I did not understand yet was that a consistent story is not the same thing as a true story. A person can rehearse a version of events until it is perfectly smooth, until every edge has been worn down and every contradiction has been resolved. And that smoothness is not proof of anything except that the person has told the story many times. I know that now. I did not know it then. By the 4th month I was visiting. The facility was 90 minutes away and I drove out on Saturday mornings, which became the rhythm of my weekends. Renee was striking in person, tall with a stillness about her that read as confidence or composure. And she had a way of holding your gaze when she talked to you that felt like she was giving you her full attention, which felt rare and valuable. The visiting room was loud and she made it feel quiet. She made me feel like the only person in it. She started calling me her person within the first few weeks of visiting. Not her girlfriend, not her partner, her person. She said it like it was a thing that had already been decided. A fact of the situation rather than a choice either of us had made. At the time I found it charming, that certainty, that ease of claiming. Looking back, I understand it differently. But I am getting ahead of myself. The first time she asked me for money, it was small. She needed funds added to her commissary account, basic things, soap and stamps and phone credit. I added it without much thought. Because these things are genuinely necessary and genuinely expensive. And it felt like what a person does for someone they care about. Then it was a little more the next month, for a specific reason she explained clearly. Then more after that. For her mother who was struggling with something. I do not remember exactly what now because there were eventually so many reasons. All of them reasonable in isolation, that they blur together in my memory. I want to be honest about the money because I think people who have not been in a situation like this imagine that you hand over large amounts at once, and you would have to be foolish not to notice. That is not how it works. It works in small amounts that accumulate, each one with a sensible explanation, each one too small to feel like a line being crossed. By the time you are somewhere that would have alarmed you at the beginning, you have crossed so many small thresholds that going back feels like it would mean admitting that all of the previous ones were mistakes, and that admission is painful in a way that makes staying easier than stopping. I spent a little over $9,000 over the course of those 2 years. I did not know that number until I sat down one evening, about 18 months in, and added it up. It came from my savings, from credit, from the careful small accumulations of years of responsible financial choices. $9,000 in 2 years, and I had told myself at each step that it was fine, that it was what people do for people they love, that I would get it back somehow, which was never a coherent thought but was a comfort I returned to anyway. There were signs I did not let myself read clearly. My sister was the first one to say something direct. She visited the facility with me once in the early months when things still felt clean and clear, and on the drive home she was quiet for a long time and then said that Renee had been watching me in a way that made her uncomfortable. I asked what she meant. She said it was hard to describe, that it was the way you watch something you are trying to manage rather than something you care about. I got defensive. I said she did not know Renee and had not given her a real chance. My sister let it go, but she did not change her mind. And she told me later that she had decided that day to stay close to me and wait, because she knew I would need her when it ended. My friend David was less patient. David asked me to my face, around the 8-month mark, whether I had considered that I was being manipulated. I said that I had considered it, and I did not think I was. He asked what evidence I had for that conclusion. I told him about how consistent her story was, how well I knew her by then, how she had never given me a reason not to trust her. He said that a person skilled at manipulation would know to be consistent, and would make sure never to give you a visible reason not to trust her. I told him he was being cynical. He said that there was a difference between cynicism and pattern recognition, and that he was worried about me. I stopped talking to David about Renee after that, which meant I slowly stopped talking to David very much at all, because Renee was the main thing in my life and I could not talk about it with him. That isolation was something I only understood in retrospect. It happened gradually, the way these things do. I was spending more and more time and energy and money on Renee, which meant less time and energy and money for everything else. And I was also actively reducing my contact with the people who expressed concern, which meant my circle of real, honest relationships got smaller, while the one relationship that was consuming everything got larger. By the time I was 18 months in, Renee was the organizing fact of my life, and almost everyone who might have told me that clearly was either gone from my daily experience, or had learned not to mention it. The thing that finally broke through was something small, the way the important things often are. I was on a call with her one evening, and she was telling me about a conflict she was having with another woman in her unit, describing it in that precise and compelling way she had, and something in the story snagged on something she had told me 3 months earlier. A different story about the same woman but with different details that could not both be true. I did not say anything on the call. I finished the conversation normally, said goodnight, and then sat with that small snag feeling for a long time. I went back through my notes. I had been keeping notes since early on, a habit from work, and so I had written records of a lot of what she had told me. I spent 3 evenings going through them carefully, the way I would go through documents for a case, looking for inconsistencies I had explained away or not noticed at the time. I found more than I expected. Not everything contradicted itself, but enough did. Enough to show me that the story had been constructed with an audience in mind, which was me, and had been adjusted over time based on what worked and what needed to change. I did not confront her immediately. I spent another 2 weeks in a state that I could only describe as grief mixed with anger mixed with something that felt almost like embarrassment, though that word is too small for it. I had been so certain. I had defended her to my sister, and to David and to everyone who had expressed doubt. And I had done it with the particular confidence of someone who believed they had examined the question carefully and reached a sound conclusion. That confidence had been wrong, and facing how wrong it had been meant facing that my judgment, which I had trusted completely, had failed me in a serious way. I eventually called a friend who worked as an investigator, someone I had met through my firm, and asked for a favor. I asked her to look at the public records from Renee's case, not to dig or to harm, just to tell me what was actually there. She called me back for days later. She was not unkind about it, but she was clear. The case had been straightforward. There had been surveillance footage. There had been multiple witnesses whose accounts aligned with each other. The assault had put a person in the hospital for 2 days. The missing money was documented. The public defender had actually filed several motions on Renee's behalf and had done more than Renee had ever told me. None of the things Renee had described as proof of her innocence held up against the actual record. I sat with that information for a week before I did anything. When I called her next, I did not tell her what I had found right away. I let the conversation go normally for a while, and then I asked her in a neutral voice to tell me again about the surveillance footage, because I had been thinking about it and wanted to understand that part better. There was a pause that told me everything, a fraction of a second of recalculation, and then she said something that did not match anything she had told me before. I asked a follow-up question. She answered it. I asked another. By the end of the call, 3 different versions of the same events had appeared in the conversation, and she had noticed that I was noticing. And her voice had changed in a way I had never heard before, tighter and more careful and less warm. I told her at the end that I needed some time to think. She said she understood. Then she said, very quietly, that she hoped I was not going to let other people's versions of her story replace what she had told me directly. That sentence, the way she framed it, putting my own investigation in the category of other people's versions, was the clearest thing she had said to me in 2 years. It was manipulation in its plain form, the attempt to make my judgment something external and suspect rather than my own. I did not call her back. She called me several times over the following weeks, and the calls moved through stages. First they were warm and concerned, asking if I was okay, saying she was worried about me. Then they became more urgent, saying she needed to hear from me, that she was struggling without our connection. Then they became explanatory, long messages about the case and why certain things looked the way they looked. If you did not have the full context, then they became something closer to accusatory, suggesting that I had been influenced by people who wanted to see her fail, that I owed her the benefit of the doubt after everything we had been through together. I listened to all of them. I did not call back. I reached out to David first. That was the hardest call I have made in my adult life, not because I expected him to be cruel about it, but because he had told me clearly, and I had not listened, and saying that out loud to someone who had been right was difficult in a way I had not fully prepared for. David was not cruel. He said he was sorry, which surprised me, and I asked what he was sorry for when he had been right. He said being right about something like that was not something he felt good about. We talked for 2 hours. It was the beginning of something that had needed to begin for a long time. I called my sister next. She cried a little, which surprised me more than David not being unkind had. She said she had been so scared for me, and I said I knew. And I said I was sorry for not listening sooner, and she said I did not need to apologize, which was generous because I did. The financial piece took me about a year to fully address. The credit was the hardest part. The slow, careful work of reducing what I had accumulated by spending money I did not have on a person who had been performing a version of themselves designed to extract it. I do not say that with bitterness, or at least I try not to. The bitterness was real for a while, sharp and hot and useful in certain ways because it kept me from softening the memory into something more comfortable. But bitterness has a way of becoming its own kind of prison if you hold it too long. And I was not interested in that. What I have been more interested in, and more honest with myself about, is the question of how it happened. Not what Renee did, because what she did is relatively simple to understand, but how I let it happen. How I used my own intelligence and knowledge and supposed carefulness to build a case for something. That was not true. That is a question I think about most because it is the question with the most useful answers. The honest answer is that I wanted to believe her. Not in a naive way, not because I was incapable of thinking critically, but because believing her meant the story was a good one. It meant I was someone who had found a real connection in an unusual place, who had been smart enough to see past the situation to the person, who had offered something meaningful to someone in genuine need. That version of myself was appealing. And once I was invested in that version of myself, Every piece of evidence that supported it felt like confirmation, and every piece that challenged it felt like something to be explained or discounted. That is the thing about being deceived by someone skilled at it. It does not require you to be stupid. It requires you to want something, and then it works with what you want. Renee did not have to make me believe things that were obviously false. She just had to keep giving me reasons to believe what I already wanted to believe, and she was very good at that. I am not the same person I was before this. I do not say that as a tragedy because I do not think it is one. I am more honest with myself about what I want and why I want it. I am quicker to notice when I am using logic to justify a feeling, rather than actually thinking clearly. I am better at sitting with uncertainty rather than reaching for the comfortable version of things. I am also, and I want to say this without making it sound like a silver lining that erases the cost, genuinely grateful for the people who told me the truth when it was inconvenient to tell it, and I hold those relationships differently now, with more care and more intention. David and I still talk every week. My sister is closer to me than she has been since we were children. Those things are real, and they came out of something hard and they matter. I do not know what I would say to someone who is in the early stages of a connection like the one I had with Renee. Someone who is reading this and recognizing pieces of their own situation in mine. I would not say that everyone inside is lying to you because that is not true and it is not fair. I would say that wanting something to be true is not a reason to stop checking whether it is. I would say that the people in your life who express concern deserve a real answer to their concern, not a defensive one. I would say that love, real love, does not require you to turn off your judgment. And if someone is asking you to do that in any way at all, that is worth paying attention to. I would also say that being wrong, being genuinely deeply wrong about something you are certain of, is survivable. It does not feel that way when you are inside it. It feels like the ground has been pulled away, and there is nothing solid left to stand on. But the ground comes back. You rebuild the solid parts, and some of them come back stronger than they were before because now you know what they are made of. There is one more thing I want to say, and it is about shame, because shame was a big part of what I carried for a long time after this, and I think it deserves to be named directly. I was ashamed of being wrong. I was ashamed of having spent money I did not have on someone who was using me. I was ashamed of the confidence with which I had defended her to people who were right to be skeptical, and of the coldness with which I had treated some of those people when they tried to help me. I was ashamed in a way that made me want to keep the whole thing private and small, to not tell anyone the full version, to let the people who knew about it believe a softer story than the true one. That shame kept me stuck for a while. It sat on me and made everything heavier and made the idea of talking honestly about what had happened feel worse than it actually was. The thing about shame is that it does not protect you from anything. It does not prevent the same thing from happening again. It just makes you feel bad about the past without giving you anything useful to take into the future. Working through it, talking about it with people I trusted and eventually with a therapist, was what actually helped. Not erasing the responsibility or pretending it did not cost what it cost, but separating the fact of having been wrong from the conclusion that being wrong made me a fool or a failure. Being deceived by someone skilled at deception is not evidence of being stupid. It is evidence of being human. The skill involved in what Renee did was real, and it was pointed at a real vulnerability in me, which was the desire to be someone who could see clearly in difficult situations, who could find the good thing in an unlikely place. That desire is not a flaw. It just needed to be paired with better honesty about what I was seeing, and why I wanted to see it that way. I have told this story to a few people since everything happened, and the responses have been interesting. Some people express sympathy immediately and completely, and I appreciate that even when it makes me a little uncomfortable, because the full sympathy version tends to leave out my own role in it. Some people ask a lot of questions about Renee, wanting to understand how she did it, what the specific techniques were, and I understand that impulse, but I try to redirect it, because I think the more useful questions are the ones about me. And some people get quiet in a way that tells me they are recognizing something from their own life, some situation where they wanted something to be true and made choices that supported the wanting, rather than the truth. And those are the conversations I find most valuable. The ones where the story does something real for someone instead of just satisfying a curiosity. That is the story. Not a love story, though it felt like one for a long time. Not a cautionary tale, though there are things in it worth being cautious about. Just a true account of something that happened to me, told as honestly as I know how to tell it, for anyone who might need to hear it.